You're listening to Human Rights Radio Podcast. Today, we'll define the human rights violations in North Korea and explore their historical background. The world's largest prison is 46,541 square miles in size and currently holds 26 million inmates. They are victim of brainwashing, starvation, torture, and brutal execution. Freedoms of speech, expression, movement, and information are non-existent. The prisoners have committed no crime and are only guilty of being born in the wrong place. Yet for this, they have received a life sentence with no chance at parole. This is the Democratic Republic of Korea, more commonly known as North Korea. It is also commonly known within international relations that North Koreans are indeed suffering at the hands of their dictator, Supreme Leader Kim Jong-un. It is known that there are over 3 million dead of starvation, and the surviving bear brainwashing propaganda, unreasonable imprisonment, torture, forced labor, and suppression of individuality and choice. The current state of North Korea is known. What is less spoken of is how it arrived at this state. What conceived this crisis? Today, we're going to look at the historical, structural, and direct violences that built the world's largest prison. I gathered information from primary, secondary, and tertiary sources that provide all the details we need to understand this matter. I learned that North Korea was first wounded by Japanese occupation and found healing in the Soviet Union's support. After a devastating flood and the Soviet collapse, however, the East Asian state fell into famine. The young regime misused international aid, using it for military purposes rather than for fulfilling the people's basic needs. Furthermore, the regime insists that North Koreans practice juche, or self-reliance, and then crushes their efforts to provide for themselves. As this all unfolds, the citizens are propagandized and shamed into believing that their suffering is their doing, and that to speak against the regime is a betrayal worthy of death. The founding fathers of North Korea envisioned a nation of self-sufficiency, pride, and power. It was to rise, new and beautiful, from the ashes of occupation. North Korea was born, but due to the abuses upon it, it cannot live up to the Kim family's expectations, the very ones who commit said abuses. Greedy for an international reverence that it never had, the DPRK shows off its parading citizens like trophy children while beating them behind closed doors. The country's history shows that the regime is not a case of random psychopathy, but the product of a painful history. First, let's take a closer look at what life is like for the average North Korean. Many defectors have come forward with their stories, which contrast sharply against Kim Jong-un's advertisement of a happy country. Yeonmi Park is perhaps the most well-known defector, having become a restless activist and writer. Her memoir, titled In Order to Live, A North Korean Girl's Journey to Freedom, details the North Korean life. She starved, witnessed public executions and beatings. Her father was arrested for making private sales outside of government regulations, and every inch of her life was controlled by said government. Regarding the regime, Park wrote, "They need to control you through your emotions, making you a slave to the state by destroying your individuality and your ability to react to situations based on your own experience of the world. It is a human rights abuse for a government to control the emotions and processing skills of citizens. It strips them of their humanity, of their personhood, which is essentially the root of any human rights violation. The mere existence of defectors is proof of this. The fact that North Koreans will risk their own lives and their family members' lives in order to escape the country speaks to how the regime is not a normal dictatorship. The fact that countless North Koreans have ripped themselves away from loved ones, from their homes, from all they know, just to have a chance at freedom speaks to how extreme the human rights abuses are in North Korea. The act of tyranny and brainwashing is itself an abuse of human rights. The regime's refusal to provide basic needs for its citizens, or prisoners, is an abuse of human rights. I said a moment ago that the North Korean regime refuses to provide basic needs for its citizens. Indeed it does, funding military projects and Kim Jong-un's luxurious lifestyle instead of funding agriculture, healthcare, education, and so on. One primary source gave a very detailed report on these issues. I found a transcript of a joint hearing titled North Korea, Human Rights, Refugees, and Humanitarian Challenges. It was held in 2004 by the Subcommittee on Asia and the Pacific and the Subcommittee on International Terrorism, Non-Proliferation and Human Rights from the U.S. House of Representatives. These subcommittees welcomed 4 North Korean defectors to testify on the crimes against humanity that they witnessed while living in the Hermit Kingdom, as the country is nicknamed. To preface the hearing, Representative James Leach specified the human rights violations within North Korea. He said,
"The people of North Korea have endured some of the great humanitarian traumas of our time. Inside North Korea, they suffer at the hands of a totalitarian dynasty that permits no dissent and maintains an inhumane system of prison camps that house an estimated 200,000 political inmates. The regime strictly curtails freedom of speech, press, religion, and assembly and movement. Since the collapse of the centralized agricultural system in the 1990s, more than 2 million North Koreans are estimated to have died from starvation."
After specifying the violations, Leach explained how they are perpetuated.
"But we know that Kim uses at least 3 methods to maintain power: the political prison camp system, controlling access to information, and controlling access to food. Kim Jong-il uses food as a weapon against his own people. Working with these defectors has made me believe that Kim Jong-il is the worst violator of human rights in the world today by the sheer number of people he has killed directly through his policies, his involvement in international drug trafficking, counterfeiting, the abducting of Japanese and South Korean citizens, and proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. The famine triggered a refugee crisis, and despite the horrible treatment of North Korean refugees by the Chinese government, which puts a price on their heads or repatriates them when they are caught and jails people who try to help them, they keep fleeing to China. Many North Koreans are faced with a terrible choice: stay in North Korea and starve to death slowly, or flee to China and take your chances of becoming a slave laborer on a Chinese farm or being sold into a brothel."
Leach's presentation was followed by the testimonies of 4 North Korean defectors. Their stories attest to the regime's brutality. One defector, Soon Ok Lee, was employed as a guard in a prison camp. She witnessed that prisoners are experimented on with biochemical weapons. The following is a part of her statement before the House of Representatives subcommittees.
The prison guards brought 50 women into an auditorium, and then the guards left. The officials instructed me to give out to 50 women a liquid saturated cabbage that was in white buckets. When I handed this to the women, the officials told them to eat it. After the women ate it, blood came out from their mouths and their rectums. It looked like something had exploded inside them. In just a few minutes, they were all kneeling and falling forward. The blood that came out of them went for 5 to 6 feet. There was pandemonium and screaming. I was taken out of the auditorium and told to wash my hands. The next day, the camp security director and the 3 individuals were meeting and congratulating each other and saying that the results were greater than expected, the efficacy even greater than expected.
This is happening, present day, in North Korea. In order to understand how it came to this present state, however, we need to visit the past. A biographical article, a historical analysis, and other similar secondary sources enable this time travel. On August 22, 1910, the Empire of Japan annexed the Korean peninsula. The Japanese military was a formidable force and did this easily. Over the past decades, many Koreans have come forward with their stories of the occupation. Their descendants also pass on their words, cementing the occupation in history so that it may never be forgotten. This helps in understanding the psychology of the North Korean regime. One Korean author, Alexander Chi, wrote of what his grandfather told him. Chi titled his piece, "My Family's Shrouded History is a National One for Korea." It was published by the New York Times in 2020.
Korean newspapers were closed or censored heavily. Japanese language and culture were taught in schools, and Koreans were forced to take Japanese names. And as your Korean name connects you to your ancestors, changing that name meant losing them too. Many Koreans took their lives rather than change their names. Others lived with the humiliation, maintaining their Korean name in secret.
The practice of Korean culture was a threat to Japan's authority, and thus it was crushed. The Korean people were no longer allowed to be Korean. They had to adopt an identity as Japanese. They were also no longer allowed to be people, in a sense. They were stripped of their freedoms, their rights, and their dignity. A South Korean woman named Kimiko Kaneda attested to this. She spoke on being forced into sex slavery at the age of 16, giving her testimony for the Atonement Project of the Asian Women Fund.
How did I feel? I felt as if we were taken here to be killed. I could not but weep. No one talked. All were weeping. That night we slept there, and in the morning we were put in those rooms. Soldiers came to my room, but I resisted with all my might.
The Korean people were not their own any longer. Nothing belonged to them. Not their traditions, their lives, their bodies, or their work. Chi's grandfather remembered working at a government-run fishery. where his Japanese superiors represented his work as their own. This is similar to how the DPRK operates today. Any success that a North Korean manages to have is quickly owned by the regime. Meanwhile, any strife that befalls a North Korean is solely the individual's fault. Fortunately, the occupation did not last forever. In August of 1945, Japan bore a tragedy of its own. The Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings caused the nation to turn inwards, and it released Korea shortly after World War II. During this brief freedom, the Korean people tried to remember who they are. Chi's grandfather told him that
the end of the occupation left behind many Koreans who had never been taught Korean, at a loss for knowing only Japanese. When some tried to make their own Korean flags to wave in celebration, they could not remember the exact way to render it.
perhaps this accounts for the North's blaring nationalism. Never again will it be stolen from itself. Never again will it forget itself. Never again will Korea be punished for being, well, Korean. In a twisted way, however, North Koreans currently are punished for being who they are. They are human beings punished for having needs, desires, ideas, and the misfortune of being born in the Hermit Kingdom. They are kept silent by their dictator's violent ways. But Kim Jong-un's attempts to muffle their cries has been pointless as he continuously gives himself away as a tyrant. The international community cannot help but to see through him, his propaganda, and his isolationist actions. In fact, his behavior has been globally analyzed, one example of this being with the hearing I referenced earlier. At one point, Japan restricted the freedom and basic needs of Koreans at large as a method of control. Today, the DPRK regime does the same thing to North Koreans. Instead of turning in a 180, the regime spun too far and landed at 360. How and why could it have gone full circle? It is known that over 200,000 North Koreans are dying in prison camps, working as slaves, enduring torture, and are being used as guinea pigs for biochemical weapons. It is known that over 60% are living in poverty, 74% are not allowed to use electricity, and millions have starved to death in the last 2 decades. The what in North Korea is known. The true questions lie in the how and the why. A continued look at its history may provide answers. Bruce Cummings, North Korean expert, took a deep dive into the country's history to understand how it became what it is today. Instead of painting the regime as an inexplicably formed monster, he narrows in on several different aspects of Korean history and culture that played key roles in its development. This analysis is provided in his 2003 book, North Korea, Another Country. Its pages teach that Korean society has been long reliant on slavery. The nation has yet to fully shake this terrible dependency. Non-elite North Koreans are, essentially, slaves to the state, even though the practice was abolished in 1894. This society was also built on a prominent class system. This caste-like system has reached its most extreme present-day state. Nothing interrupted this development. There were no revolutions or social movements as there have been in other countries where the citizenry attacked oppressive classism. Perhaps Koreans were too busy dealing with Japan and the occupiers who followed them, the Soviets. Korea's liberty from Japan was short-lived. The USSR swarmed the peninsula during World War II, chasing off the Japanese military. The Union remained in the north, supporting it militarily and politically while making a deep impression on its society. Cummings and other scholars agree that the cultish worship of the Kim family is indeed inspired by Stalinism. Kim Il-sung, the first leader of North Korea, studied communist leaders with a passion. The USSR was his greatest example and his greatest support. Thus, it is no wonder that his country collapsed alongside the Soviet Union on December 26, 1991. Not a very Merry Christmas. Worse yet, floods decimated North Korean farmland in 1995 and 1996. Crops were ruined, and a food shortage ensued. First failure, then floods, and finally famine. North Korea was drowning, but Kim Il-sung would not admit it. His country was supposed to be strong, impervious, a force to be reckoned with. Despite his stubbornness, the international community extended their hands. Millions of dollars in aid and supplies was offered to him, but the first supreme leader refused. After almost a century of having outsiders in control, Kim wanted little to do with anyone who was not North Korean. Of course, the regime eventually had to accept foreign aid, but this was done to keep up appearances. Aid workers would pass out bowls of rice in orphanages while news cameras rolled. As soon as they stopped filming, the meals were literally taken from the children's hands to be saved for soldiers and members of the elite. Additionally, Kim Sr. redirected any monetary aid toward his military and weapons development. Citizens began opening private markets. but these were quickly outlawed so that they remained dependent on the regime. This frustratingly goes against the very ideology that Kim pushed, Juche, meaning self-reliance. Essentially, Kim Il-sung and his successors have preached that North Koreans must solve their own problems and make their own way. One would think that opening private markets is in agreement with Juche. Yet the very existence of the markets only highlighted that the regime was falling short. The markets were an insult, so they had to go. What the Kim regime must understand is that the markets would never have sprouted if it had put the international aid to good use and reevaluated its priorities. Bruce Cummings visited North Korea in the early 2000s and saw that the markets were still operating, as law enforcement officers are themselves struggling and will keep quiet with a bribe or two. Cummings observed that
signs urged self-reliance, using Maoist phraseology literally meaning regeneration through your own efforts. I did not see this slogan in the cities and assumed it was a way of saying don't expect much investment from the centre. There didn't seem to be much either.
Indeed, there was not and is not much investment going toward the majority population of North Korea. The investment is in the military and the elite, as aforementioned. A couple tertiary sources focus on this issue. Financial researcher Prableen Bajpai called out the regime's practices in her 2023 article for Investopedia.
The regime's priority to make Korea a defense economy has overshadowed development, food production, living standards, and human rights. A major issue currently facing the country is human trafficking. Many men, women, and children are subjected to forced labor and sex trafficking. North Korea is a primary source of labor for foreign governments, most often Russia and China. North Koreans do not have a choice in the work the government assigns them, cannot change jobs, and face punishment from the government if they try to escape their forced labor.
While the people agonize, the regime pours funding into its weapons program. One young man, Il-hyuk Kim, had much to say about this for an interview on NPR. Kim, a North Korean defector, said to his hosts,
"The government turns our blood and sweat into a luxurious life for the leadership and missiles that blast our hard work into the sky. We used to think that the money spent on just one missile could feed us for 3 months, but the government doesn't care and is only concerned with maintaining their power."
The violences, structural and direct, grow on top of one another. North Korean human rights abuses are rooted in the country's history. Even Kim Jong-un, the most brutal of his family so far, is only a product of the archaic system and his spoiled upbringing. But there comes a point for all people when they must look at their life and the society around them and measure themselves. There comes a point when they must take accountability for their present and future selves. Kim Jong-un undoubtedly knows that what he does is wrong. Why else would he be so secretive? If he was so convinced that he was faultless, he would not lie about the state of his country. He would not show off cheering crowds and smiling soldiers while throwing citizens into prison camps just for saying one word against him. The joke of it all is that Kim is not even the one who is truly in control. As desperate as North Korea is to be recognized as a powerful nation, free from occupation, it is still in the hands of China and Russia. The North Korean regime is a puppet, and China and Russia share the strings to make it dance. Does Kim know this? Or is he deluded by his own greed for power? No amount of analysis can explain why he does what he does, but it can somewhat explain how North Korea is what it is. In the words of Bruce Cummings,
"No society can be understood without knowing where it came from."
So, now we know where North Korea came from. The new question is, where is North Korea heading? That concludes our discussion today. For information on how to support North Korean defectors and rescue missions, visit libertyinnorthkorea.com. Thank you for listening to this Human Rights Radio podcast.